Tonight, we open the quiet door of time and step gently into the nursery of the Tudors, a place where lullabies once drifted in candlelight, and where tiny lives flickered out before they could bloom. This is not the throne room of Henry VIII, nor the glittering court of Elizabeth I. This is the softest, smallest chamber in the palace. Tucked behind heavy doors and silken drapes, the floor is worn from the shuffle of nurses' feet. The air smells faintly of lavender and warmed milk. Dolls made of cloth sit propped against carved oak chairs. A wooden cradle creaks with every breeze that slips through the window pane. Here, royal children took their first breaths, and some, their last. When we speak of the Tudors, we often speak of crowns and courtships, of banquets and betrayals. But the story you're about to hear is of those who never lived long enough to wear a crown or cause a scandal. They were born to be seen, perhaps adored, perhaps married off like pieces on a chessboard. But fate wrote them out of the game before they could take a turn. We begin, as all stories do, with the name Elizabeth. Not the Queen, you know, but the little girl who came before. Born on a summer's day in 1492 to Queen Elizabeth of York and King Henry VII. She was the fourth child in a growing dynasty that was still learning how to rule. The Tudors had only held the throne for a breath of time. Every birth was a declaration this line will continue. This realm will endure. She was named after her mother. And maybe that tells you everything. A daughter named in reflection. Like a mirror made of flesh and hope. She arrived just months after her brother Henry. Yes, the Henry who would one day break with Rome and with 6 wives. At that time, he was just a baby, still learning to grip things with uncertain hands. Now imagine the nursery, 2 cradles, side by side, 2 nurses, singing half in Latin, half in lullaby. Margaret, the older sister, might have peeked in from the doorway, curious and solemn, clutching a linen rabbit. No portraits survive of little Elizabeth. No detailed descriptions, but we can guess. Fair hair, perhaps clear eyes, a heartbeat no different from yours or mine. She lived only 3 years, long enough to walk, long enough to laugh, long enough to be loved. But not long enough to be remembered. She died in September of 1495. Quickly. The records say, no illness was recorded. No slow decline. One moment she was playing, and the next gone. We do not know what took her, but we know what came after. The palace turned quiet. Her mother wept behind a curtain. The servants moved more softly, and the Queen's household, always bound to duty, prepared for mourning. The funeral was grand, almost too grand for a child. 11 days of mourning, a golden canopy above her coffin, banners bearing the arms of saints and kings, priests whispering Latin prayers, horses draped in black pulling her bier to Westminster Abbey. Perhaps it was grief, perhaps it was politics, or perhaps both. For the Tudors, even death had to be performed with purpose. She was buried near the shrine of Edward the Confessor, the same sacred ground where kings rested. A tomb was built from black marble, inlaid with brass. Her name etched into eternity, Elizabeth, daughter of a king and queen. A poem was written in Latin, its lines heavy with sorrow and hope. It spoke of Atropos, the mythical figure who cuts the thread of life. It asked God to give her joy in heaven, since earth had held her for so short a time. And then, silence. Her name faded from the chronicles. Her story, tucked between margins, lost in the shadows of her more famous siblings. But this is not the end. Her death marked only the first of 3 sorrows that would visit the Tudor nursery. Ahead lie 2 more names, 2 more small gravestones beneath the vaulted arches of Westminster. A brother who might have changed the course of succession. A sister born in the wake of grief, destined to take her mother with her. And through it all, the quiet of the nursery remained. The nursemaids came and went. The cradle was cleaned and reused. Life continued, as it always does in palaces, dutifully, elegantly, and without pause. So, linger here a moment longer. Listen to the wind, tapping gently at the stained glass. Imagine small hands reaching for a toy, a child's laugh echoing off stone walls. And then, like a candle snuffed too soon, only stillness. Now, take a breath. We are not finished. There is more to unfold. Close your eyes again. The nursery is quiet now. The wind outside shakes the lattice gently. And in your mind, you hear its footsteps on old stone. The swish of velvet, a soft hum rising from the hall. And in that space between memory and mist, let us return to the beginning of the sorrow, to the brief and delicate life of the first Elizabeth. It is the summer of 1492. England is still learning to speak the language of the Tudors. The wars of the Roses are no longer bleeding the soil red, but the wounds they left are fresh and aching. Henry VII, the new king, has claimed his crown not by peace, but by victory, by right of conquest. Some whisper, and his marriage to Elizabeth of York, the golden daughter of the fallen House of York, was not just a love story, but a treaty in human form. From this fragile peace, a child is born. They name her Elizabeth, a name heavy with hope, heavy with reconciliation. She is a daughter of Lancaster and York, a symbol stitched into the living flesh of a nation desperate to believe in the future again. And in the royal apartments of Sheen Palace, the Queen, still barely more than a girl herself, holds her newborn daughter in her arms and smiles. What did she dream for her? Did she imagine a court in Burgundy, a French alliance, or a quiet marriage to an English noble? Did she see her daughter grown, leading processions in cloth of gold, crowned with spring flowers or pearls? We cannot know, but we can imagine the way her fingers must have traced the child's face, the way she leaned in to smell the sweetness of her hair, the way her voice grew softer when she whispered the name they shared. In those early months, Elizabeth joined the royal nursery, where her older sister Margaret played with a growing sense of command, and where her brother Henry, still wrapped in the clumsy limbs of babyhood, tugged at blankets and furniture alike. Elizabeth and Henry were close in age, just months apart. Near twins in royal infancy, they would have shared baths, blankets, toys carved from ash wood, and the same nursemaid who gently shushed them into sleep when the palace walls groaned with politics. For 3 years, she lived, and that is perhaps the most important thing to say. She lived. She smiled. She reached out for her father's rings, and tugged at the embroidered hem of her mother's sleeve. She giggled with Henry, chasing him across silk carpets, her hair loose and golden. We always speak of royal children as future queens or pawns, but before that, they are children. Elizabeth was a child, and then she was gone. It was the month of September in the year 1495. There are no detailed records of her final illness, no last words, no vigil at her bedside. All we know is that her death was sudden and swift. A short note in a ledger, a whisper lost in a hallway, and then funeral bells. The silence that followed must have felt unbearable. For Elizabeth of York, who had known the pain of her own brother's disappearance in the Tower as a child, the loss of her daughter would not have been just maternal. It would have echoed through every unresolved chamber of her own past. For Henry VII, always cold, always calculating, this was not just the death of a daughter. It was the loss of a political symbol, a crack in the polished image of Tudor stability. And so they buried her with grandeur, with purpose, with precision. The ceremony lasted 11 days. 11 days for a child not yet 4. Her coffin was borne beneath a golden canopy, her bier draped in purple, the royal colour of kings. Horses, draped in black velvet, pulled the carriage through the streets, past onlookers who did not know her, but bowed all the same. Monks sung mass every morning. A velvet-covered chair stood empty in her honour, pulled behind her hearse like a silent ghost. It was not just a funeral, it was a performance. A declaration? Here lies Elizabeth, daughter of kings. Buried with saints and crowned men, they laid her in Westminster Abbey, near the shrine of St. Edward the Confessor. Her tomb, made of black marble and brass, was carved with careful words. Her name, her lineage, a prayer for her soul. On its face, the image of a young girl, dressed in Tudor finery, hands pressed in eternal prayer. And above her, always, candles. But not everything is marble and poetry. Not all grief can be sealed in stone. After the final hymn faded, after the final candle flickered out, her name slipped from memory. She is not in the paintings, not in the legends, only a brass plate in the corner of a church, and the silence that follows when no one speaks of her. Yet she matters. Her death changed the rhythm of the Tudor household. It shook the quiet confidence of a newly crowned dynasty. It reminded everyone, kings included, that bloodlines are brittle, that even the royal nursery is not safe from the scythe of time. It reminded Henry and Elizabeth that the future could vanish overnight, and it was only the beginning. The loss of little Elizabeth was the first tremor, the first dark curtain drawn across the nursery windows. There would be more, 2 more children born, only to be carried in silence to the abbey, their lives reduced to footnotes, and their deaths mourned in private. But before we reach them, linger a while longer here. Return to the nursery once more. The cradle is empty now. The toys sit undisturbed. The air is still. Somewhere down the corridor, Margaret practices her curtsy. Henry, oblivious to loss, babbles in a nursemaid's arms, and the Queen Elizabeth of York closes the door behind her, holding her grief like a secret. Outside, the world moves on. The court plots, ambassadors arrive, bells ring for harvest festivals. But in this one room, time slows. A name echoes once, then fades. Elizabeth, not the great queen, not the lion-hearted virgin, just a little girl, a first daughter, a fleeting promise, a thread snipped too soon. And as we prepare to speak of the next child, of the boy who would follow her into the grave, let us carry her name gently with us. Let us not forget that she laughed, that she was held, that for 3 short years, she was loved not for what she symbolized, but simply for who she was. And maybe, if you listen closely, the nursery still remembers. Maybe the floorboards still creak with her footsteps. Maybe her name still floats in the hush before dawn. We move forward now, into deeper shadow. The next cradle waits. Another child. Another chapter in this quiet, aching history. But for now, let the candle stay lit a little longer. For Elizabeth, and the cradle beside him, once shared, now sat empty. A reminder, not just of death, but of duty. The loss of Edmund may have faded from the court's conversation, but it settled quietly in the family's rhythm. The Queen, already marked by grief once, I bore it in the silence of her hands. Perhaps she visited his grave, though no record remains. Perhaps she wept in solitude, for there was no grand memorial carved for the boy who had been born a duke and died a shadow. There is no poem written for him, no painting, not even a lock of his hair preserved in a reliquary. But within the walls of the royal apartments, He lingered. His nursemaid still turned her head at the sound of a child's cry. His cradle still bore the imprint of his weight. And in the empty space left behind, the memory of his brief laughter echoed. There is something uniquely piercing in the death of a child, too young to speak. No last words to recall. No diary entries. No confidences whispered behind tapestries. Only the helpless weight of what might have been. The Tudor dynasty, still young and brittle, understood this. Well, children were not just children. They were futures, walking on unsteady legs. They were alliances in the making. Heirs to secure the line. Pawns to be moved or protected. Every child mattered. Every loss was a subtraction of power, of hope, of story. And yet, they were also simply loved. Imagine, if you can, the Queen's lap, how Edmund would have curled into it, how her hands would have stroked his small back as he dozed. Imagine the king, often cold, drawn into an awkward tenderness at the sight of his youngest son grasping at his fingers. Even a king cannot remain entirely a king in the face of a child's laugh. In those rare private moments, perhaps Henry VII smiled, not as monarch, but as father. And yet, the duties of kingship are ruthless. The court moved on. Parliament was called. Alliances were made. Letters sent across the Channel. The Queen was again in confinement. For what else could be done but try again? But the loss of Edmund deepened something in the royal heart. It's not visible in letters, but it is there in the quiet reshuffling of priorities. In the sudden focus on Arthur, the firstborn, in the education of Henry, now the only surviving son. It is there in the silence surrounding Edmund's name, as though to speak it too often might invite death back through the nursery door. And so Edmund vanished from the chronicles, but not entirely. In a peculiar twist of fate, centurilateur, his name would be found scribbled in inventories, tucked in corners of cathedral records. A Duke of Somerset. Child. It reads, no epitaph, no date of death, just the title. And the word child? It is strange, isn't it? How the smallest lives can create the largest absences had Edmund lived. Everything might have shifted. 2 sons offer security. But they also present tension, rivalry, choice. In another timeline, Henry might never have become Henry VIII. He might have remained the Duke of York, while Edmund grew into the crown. Perhaps Edmund would have been cautious where Henry was reckless, pious where Henry was proud, gentle where Henry was unyielding. But we will never know. And perhaps that is the truest sorrow, not what was lost, but what never had the chance to become. In the years that followed, the Queen's health waned. The losses began to outnumber the blessings. And the nursery once filled with laughter, with songs, with the shuffling of small feet grew quieter, colder. Even Henry, the surviving boy, was sent away for his education. The rooms were aired out, the toys put away, and the fire in the hearth burned low. Still, the Abbey kept them. In Westminster, beneath the marble floors, Edmund rests near Elizabeth, brother and sister, reunited in death. Their tombs may not rise grandly above the ground, but they remain quiet, markers of forgotten royalty. They lie beneath the same vaulted ceilings that echoed with the coronations of kings, beneath stained glass that bleeds sunlight onto stone. And when the Abbey is empty, when the tourists have gone, perhaps their names still live there, in the hush of footsteps, in the flicker of candlelight. Let us speak them once more. Edmund, Elizabeth, not the famous, not the crowned, but the real. The brief, the loved. You might wonder, why does this matter? Because to remember the dead is to remember the fragile fabric of history. The Tudors are not just stained glass saints or tyrants in portraits. They were human. They were parents who held tiny hands and watched them grow still. They were children who never knew the weight of a crown, but bore the burden of expectation from their very first breath. So tonight, we do not forget Edmund. We imagine him not just in his cradle, but walking, running, perhaps laughing at a joke told by a nursemaid long since forgotten. We let him live again, not in the cold stone of a monument, but in the warmth of imagination. And as we turn the page toward the next loss, the one that would take not just a child, but a queen, we carry him with us. In your own quiet room tonight, when all is still, listen closely. You may hear him, a whisper in the nursery, a breath in the shadows. A boy whose life was brief, but never truly lost. The wind shifts again. The palace windows rattle in their frames. Somewhere in the west wing, a candle guttering beside an empty cradle finally goes out. And now, we return to the beginning of the end for the Tudor nursery, for Elizabeth of York, for the quiet, aching dream of a complete family. It is the winter of 1502. The cold has settled deep into the bones of the palace at the Tower of London. The stone walls weep with damp. The air smells of soot, iron, and wet wool. It is not a time for birth. And yet, Queen Elizabeth is with child again. She is pale, thinner than before, her footsteps slower, her eyes dimmed not just by age which she does not yet possess, but by sorrow. She has buried 2 children. Her firstborn son, Arthur, has been sent far from home to Ludlow, and she misses him. Margaret, now nearly a woman, spends more and more time at court. Henry, her lively and sharp-eyed boy, grows restless under tutors and too many expectations. But still, she hopes. This child, she believes, may bring healing. They call it a confinement, but it is more than seclusion. It is a ritual of protection, a royal retreat into silence. Tapestries are drawn, visitors are turned away. The Queen prepares to give birth in shadow, as so many women before her have done. She is alone, in the way only queens can be. And on the 11th of February, her birthday, a baby girl is born. They name her Catherine. There are no surviving portraits, no descriptions, only a few lines in royal records. A child born in the dark of winter, to a mother who would not survive her. For the labour is difficult. The Queen is weak. Infection sets in, or bleeding, or perhaps both. The physicians do what they can, which in those days meant little more than prayer and leeches. The room grows cold. Elizabeth lies pale and still on the bed where she has brought so many lives into the world, and now prepares to leave it. By the 12th of February, the Queen is dead. She was not yet 37. The court is stunned, not just by the death of their Queen, but by the sudden finality of it. The woman who had quietly stitched together the broken pieces of York and Lancaster is gone. The mother of the future, Henry VIII, the peacemaker, the golden-haired girl who once stood as England's brightest hope, now silent, wrapped in linen, her body prepared for burial. The king retreats into himself. Henry VII, always reserved, becomes hollow. He weeps in private, refuses food, paces the palace halls at night, like a ghost still wearing a crown. For the first time in his reign, he appears visibly broken. He orders masses to be sung not just in England, but across the continent. A golden effigy is made, a chapel planned. He sends for relics and prayers and alms in her name. He loved her. In his way, perhaps deeply, But kings are taught not to show too much. Now, he cannot help it, and the child Catherine lives only a few days more. Some say she died on the same day as her mother. Others whisper it was a week. But what is certain is this: she did not stay. There was no grand funeral, no titles, no effigies. Only a brief notation: Catherine, daughter to the king and queen. Deceased. A line in a ledger. A name on a burial list. And then, like a breath, she vanished. The death of Elizabeth of York did more than break the king's heart. It unstitched something in the soul of the court. The Tudor dream, so delicately built upon her union with Henry, now had one less pillar. Her children felt it. Henry, most of all. The loss of a mother leaves marks that do not fade, even in kings. With Catherine's death, the Tudor nursery fell silent. The laughter that once echoed off its stone walls was gone. The soft patter of feet, the lullabies, the late-night cries vanished. The nursemaids were dismissed. The wooden toys collected. The doors, perhaps, locked. And yet, some things linger. The Queen's death was marked in stone. In the Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey, she lies beside her husband. Their tomb is magnificent, polished, elevated, carved in Italian marble. Her effigy rests with hands folded in prayer, her crown eternally fixed to her brow. She does not look like the young girl who bore 10 children. She looks eternal. But what of Catherine? She was likely buried quietly in the same abbey, perhaps near her siblings, perhaps in a shared vault. No one knows for sure. Her grave is unmarked. Her body, folded back into the earth, became part of the abbey's breath. And yet, she too mattered. She was a daughter, however briefly, a final gift from a dying mother. A life that never learned to walk, but changed the rhythm of the realm all the same. Because after Catherine, the king would never remarry. He considered it. Negotiations were made, but no match ever came to pass. Some say it was politics. Others say it was grief. Perhaps he simply could not imagine another love. And so ends the story of the Tudor children lost too soon. Elizabeth, Edmund, Catherine, 3 names whispered only rarely. 3 tiny lives wrapped in velvet and buried beneath stone. 3 flickers of light that danced for a moment and then were gone. But in telling their stories, we bring them back not to the court, nor to the throne, but to the memory of love, the kind of love that exists in small things, in cradles and lullabies, in the warm weight of a sleeping child, in the final look exchanged between mother and daughter on a winter morning. History, for all its grandeur, is often made not by the crowned, but by the forgotten. So remember them tonight, not for what they became, but for what they were allowed to be: children, briefly held in the arms of a queen, and now held in time. And as the abbey bells toll over centuries of silence, their names rise again, soft as a breath, and steady as candlelight. Some say grief has an echo, not the kind that bounces off stone, but the kind that travels through blood, through generations. After Queen Elizabeth's death, the Tudor court wore black, but the mourning went far deeper than fabric. Servants whispered her name in corners. Her ladies clutched their rosaries with trembling fingers. The rhythm of the court slowed, like a grand clock that had lost a cog. Even the courtiers, hardened by war, scandal, and ambition, moved more quietly in her absence. The Queen had been the soft light in Henry's court, a quiet presence who did not command attention, but calmed the chaos. Now, without her, the palace felt colder, harsher, sharper, and still, life continued. It always does. Henry VII, though heavy with sorrow, turned once again to statecraft. He immersed himself in diplomacy, trade, and the careful management of succession. But something in him had shifted. His eyes were darker, his letters more clipped. He became even more controlling of his children, particularly his surviving son, Henry. Perhaps it was fear that death would take again what little remained. He kept Henry close, and yet strangely distant. The boy was now the future of the dynasty, the single thread connecting Henry's blood to England's future. Arthur, the eldest, had been betrothed and sent away. Margaret, already in preparation for her marriage to Scotland, was half out the door. Mary, the younger sister, was still a babe. But Henry bright, articulate, athletic Henry was the son he would pour his expectations into. And behind those expectations was the shadow of 3 missing names. When Henry VIII eventually came to power, he brought those ghosts with him. They did not sit at his council table. They did not ride beside him into battle. But they were there in his obsession with heirs, in his frantic search for sons, in his fear of losing what could not be replaced. He knew the nursery could fall silent. He had seen it happen. He had heard the weeping in the walls. He had watched the light leave his mother's eyes. And when his own children died, when his own queens gave birth to stillborn babes, or to infants who lived but a few hours, perhaps something in him remembered Catherine, the sister he never knew. Perhaps he remembered Edmund, the brother buried in silence. Perhaps he remembered Elizabeth, the girl whose hand he once held before she disappeared from his world entirely. Grief is a strange inheritance, but we are not here for Henry. We are here for them, for Elizabeth, for Edmund, for Catherine, the children who did not live long enough to shape England, but who shaped the hearts of those who did. The ones whose absence taught kings to fear silence. The ones who reminded even monarchs that not all battles are fought with armies. The nursery of the Tudors, once filled with hope, was now haunted with echoes. The cradles stood untouched. The toys gathered dust. The walls remembered every lullaby, every breath, every silence after the silence. But even in that stillness, there is something beautiful, because to tell their stories now, to say their names out loud, centuries later, is to break the silence they left behind. It is to light a candle in the room where no one goes anymore. It is to return, if only in spirit, to a space where small lives once bloomed. And so, in the hush, before sleep takes you, remember this. Elizabeth was more than a name shared with a queen. She was a child who played, who laughed, who was held tightly before she slipped away. Edmund was more than a Duke of Somerset. He was a boy with soft fingers, a smile perhaps like his mother's, who never learned to speak his name aloud. And Catherine, born into the deepest winter, was more than a death that claimed a queen. She was a last breath, a final heartbeat, a love that ended with the very beginning. They mattered, not for what they ruled, but for who they were, children. And tonight, in this soft moment, they are remembered not in silence, but in story, not in marble, but in words, not in history books, but in the gentle corners of your thoughts as you drift into sleep. Tomorrow, the kings and queens will return. The wars, the scandals, the crowns and betrayals. But tonight belongs to them. The forgotten ones, the flickering lights, the Tudor children who lived, if only for a moment, in the warmth of love. And now, once more, in the warmth of memory, sleep well. Little ones, close your eyes. The abbey is quiet now. The last footstep has faded down the nave, and all that remains is the hush of ancient stone and the breath of candles. High above, The stained glass windows no longer shimmer with sun, but sleep under moonlight. The tombs are still. The names, etched in brass and marble, are silent. But you are here, and that means something. You have walked, with care, through the nursery of the Tudors, not the one embroidered in tapestries or echoed in royal decrees, but the real one, the one filled with breath and heartbeat and lullaby, the one where 3 small lives began and ended before history had time to remember them. You have met Elizabeth, not the Virgin Queen, but the little girl with flaxen hair who may have reached out to hold her brother's hand before the world slipped from her fingers. You have paused with Edmund, the boy who might have changed a kingdom, whose voice was never recorded, yet whose absence helped shape a future king. And you have knelt beside the final cradle, the one that held Catherine, born in winter, a daughter whose first breath was also her mother's last. They are gone, but not lost. You see, stories are strange things. They live in the folds of time, tucked behind what is written and what is remembered. History may forget them. The tombs may grow cold, but every time we speak their names, they stir. And tonight, you have done just that. You may be lying in your bed now, the hum of the modern world outside your window, but somewhere in the quiet corner of your imagination, a candle still burns for them. You can see it, can't you? A small light in the Tudor nursery, flickering against carved oak, throwing shadows on the floor where once a child played. The palace halls are empty now, but once they held the scent of warmed milk and lavender, the soft hush of nursemaids singing, the shuffle of little shoes. The children didn't live to wear crowns or broker marriages or stand in paintings, but they lived enough to be loved, and love is never wasted. Perhaps you think, Asmanido, that only the famous shape the world, that only those whose portraits hang in galleries, whose names appear in textbooks, truly matter. But that's not quite true, is it? The world is full of echoes, and sometimes it is the softest sounds that carry furthest. A child's laughter in a stone hallway, a cradle creaking in the night, a name whispered into candlelight. Elizabeth, Edmund, Catherine. Let them be more than footnotes. Let them be more than graves. Let them be remembered as children, real, human, fragile, and luminous in their smallness. And let them remind us that behind every royal story, every king's decree or queen's coronation, there is a room like this one, a nursery, a beginning, a cradle that holds more than a child. It holds a whole world of hope. So when you drift into sleep tonight, take them with you. Let them walk with you through dreams. Let them play again in sunlit gardens. Let them laugh. Let them live not in sorrow, but in softness, because somewhere beyond time, the nursery still waits. The cradle rocks gently, the candle burns low, and the children forgotten by history, but not by us, sleep once more beneath the stars. You are still awake. The story lingers not like an echo, but like a hum just beneath the skin. Perhaps you thought it would end with the soft closing of the nursery door. But memory, like grief, doesn't obey structure. It returns in small, precise ways. And so the candle flickers once more, not to illuminate a grand throne room or a coronation, but to linger a little longer in the quiet corridors of a palace where 3 children once breathed, and 3 griefs reshaped an empire. Let us open the tapestry a little wider, because this isn't just about Elizabeth, Edmund, and Catherine. Their short lives were part of something larger, a pattern of silence that runs deep in royal history. They were not the only Tudor children to slip between the pages. In fact, if we look closely, the Tudor dynasty, so often remembered for its power and drama, was built upon the graves of many children. Did you know, for example, that Queen Elizabeth of York gave birth to 10 children? 10, and yet only 4 would survive to adulthood: Arthur, Margaret, Henry, and Mary. The others: Edward, another Elizabeth, Edmund, Catherine, and a short-lived daughter, possibly unnamed, are now barely footnotes in the story of the crown. But these weren't numbers. They were children with cradles and nurses and lullabies of their own. Take Edward, for instance, the second child of Elizabeth and Henry VII. Born in the summer of 1489, he lived only a few months. He died so young that even most Tudor historians overlook him. No records survive of his burial place. No image, no monument. His name appears briefly in baptismal registries, and then nothing. And yet, his birth was marked with joy. For a moment, he was the hope of the realm. He was to be Arthur's little brother, a second bond in the fragile new Tudor chain, but he vanished before his first winter. Imagine the silence that must have fallen over the palace. The second cradle prepared, the swaddling clothes laid out, the anticipation of another heir. And then, emptiness. And what of that other Elizabeth? Not the one you know. Not the Virgin Queen. Not the one who reigned for 44 years. But the first Elizabeth, the infant, born in the summer of 1492. We have walked her story already. 3 years, she lived just long enough to walk through the garden at Eltham Palace. Perhaps, or to hold a doll in arms, too small for the burdens of royalty. Yet she, too, faded into obscurity. If we trace the pattern, we begin to see that child loss wasn't a rare tragedy in Tudor life. It was part of its very rhythm. In a world of limited medicine and high infant mortality, even royal children protected, nursed, guarded, died before their time. But here is the difference. They died surrounded by symbolism. Every Tudor child was born with a weight upon their shoulders. They weren't just children. They were claims, alliances, threats, promises. Their lives could alter foreign treaties. Their deaths could destabilize a dynasty. Consider this when Prince Arthur, eldest son of Henry VII, died in 1502. Just weeks after the Queen's death, it nearly shattered the kingdom. Arthur wasn't a forgotten child like Elizabeth or Edmund or Catherine. He was the heir, the boy raised to be king. His wedding to Catherine of Aragon had united England and Spain. His future was the future of the Tudor line. And yet he died suddenly, perhaps of the sweating sickness. In Ludlow Castle, 17 years old, buried in Worcester Cathedral under a cold, magnificent chantry chapel his tomb, more ornate than anything his younger siblings ever received. But did you know that the Queen, Elizabeth of York, was already pregnant when Arthur died? The loss of her son and the strain of pregnancy likely contributed to her own death just months later, while giving birth to Catherine. So now, when you look at the timeline, the weight of grief becomes unbearable. In April, Prince Arthur dies. In February, Queen Elizabeth dies. Days later, baby Catherine dies. 3 deaths in less than a year. The heir, the Queen, the newborn child. This is not just a tragic sequence. It is a fracture line. And this fracture would ripple forward into Henry VIII's obsession with male heirs, into the paranoia that shaped his 6 marriages, into the Protestant Reformation, into the executions, into the rise of Elizabeth I. All of it, a result, however, quietly, of the children who did not live, of the spaces left behind. So when we say that Elizabeth, Edmund, Catherine, Edward, and the first Elizabeth were forgotten, we are wrong. They were not forgotten. They were buried into the decisions of those who lived. They were the ghosts that walked behind every coronation. They were the lullabies that never ended. Only changed key. And you still listening, still awake, have become their witness. You've seen beyond the velvet curtains. You've sat at the foot of the cradle. You've looked into the shadows of the abbey and felt the breath of lives once carried gently through cold corridors and then lost to silence. But silence isn't the same as absence, because now, in this quiet space between night and dream, they are remembered, and that remembering is a form of resurrection. But no, we cannot end here. Not yet. Because while we've walked through their lives and heard their silences, there is still one more breath, to take one final reflection that ties the soft threads of their stories to our own. So stay a little longer. Let the night stretch around you like a velvet cloak. And let us speak gently, finally, of what it means to love something fragile, and to let it go. You're still with me. And that means something, because now, as the hush of the Tudor nursery fades into the broader corridors of history, we are ready to understand what those silences truly left behind. Grief is rarely still. It moves through time, like water seeps through stone. Quietly, invisibly, but inevitably. And for the Tudors, the death of their children was not just personal tragedy. It was a political shift, a spiritual crack, a slow erosion of certainty that reshaped the world. Let's follow the thread. When Queen Elizabeth of York died in February of 1502, the Tudor dynasty lost its anchor. Her role wasn't just ceremonial. She was the living proof that York and Lancaster, the two warring houses of the Wars of the Roses, had united. Her marriage to Henry VII had calmed a country scarred by decades of civil war. With her gone, the crown felt less certain. Her younger children, Mary and Henry, were just entering the most formative years of their lives. And without a mother's presence, they were left adrift in a court that had become colder, quieter, and more politically calculating. Henry VIII was only 10 when his mother died, still young enough to weep in private, but old enough to remember every detail of her absence. He was never sent to Ludlow as Arthur had been. Instead, he remained close to the court, close to power, close to ambition, and closer still to the growing pressure of becoming the only male heir. Historians have long debated how the early deaths in the Tudor nursery affected Henry, but the signs are there, hiding between the official proclamations and the ornate portraits. He married 6 times, and each time, the question was not love. It was legacy, an heir, a son. Why? Because Henry knew deep in his bones that Tudor sons died. He had seen it happen, again and again. Elizabeth, gone at 3. Edmund, gone before he turned 2. Catherine, gone before her first week. Edward, lost in infancy. Even Arthur, the Golden Prince, the one raised for kingship, gone before his prime. Henry had reason to fear, and so his obsession with sons was not madness born of vanity. It was the desperate instinct of a man raised in a palace where cradles were often empty by the end of winter. And the irony, his greatest legacy would be a daughter, Elizabeth, but not the one who died in the summer of 1495. The second Elizabeth, the queen who would reign 44 years, the queen who would never marry, the queen who, perhaps more than anyone else, carried the ghost of the first Elizabeth with her. It's almost poetic. The child once lost in silence became the name worn by the last great Tudor monarch. And so you see, the forgotten are never truly forgotten. They rise again, not in crowns, but in issues, not in tombs, but in choices. Now let me show you one more thread. When Elizabeth of York died, her husband, Henry VII, commissioned a magnificent tomb in the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey. He did not build it for himself alone. He built it for her. Her effigy lies beside his, carved in lifelike detail, their hands clasped in eternal prayer. But look closely at the tomb's inscription. It names their children, not all of them, but some: Arthur, Margaret, Henry, Mary. The survivors: not Elizabeth, not Edmund, not Edward, not Catherine, not the ones buried quietly, or laid to rest without marble and fanfare. And yet, in the same chapel, if you move quietly between the columns, you'll find a modest grave marked only with initials: E.T. Elizabeth Tudor. Just 3 letters. No effigy, no poem, just stone. And it is enough, because that stone means someone remembered. Perhaps a sister, perhaps a priest, perhaps a nurse who could not forget the weight of a child in her arms. And now you remember. 2. You remember them all. Their stories were not preserved in grand chronicles or gilded manuscripts, but they linger in the shadows between coronations, in the pauses of sermons, in the hush that falls at the end of every royal procession. They were the stillness behind the noise, the softness behind the sword. And as you lie here tonight, with the world grown quiet, you carry something the Tudors themselves never could piece. Because grief, when remembered gently, becomes legacy, and even silence, when listened to deeply, becomes a lullaby. So let the story continue, not with trumpets and triumphs, but with the breath of history sleeping softly beside you. The cradle is still there. The candle still burns. And tomorrow, when you walk beneath the sky, you may notice that the stars above Westminster are the same ones that shone on Elizabeth, Edmund, Catherine, and the children whose names we'll never know. Let that be enough. For now, but only for now, because the next time you see a crown, or hear a king's name, or stand before a royal monument, remember, some of the strongest threads in history were first spun in the quiet of a nursery. Imagine this. The year is 1502. Spring creeps into England, pale and shy. At Ludlow Castle, a flickering fever clings to Prince Arthur, the heir to the Tudor dynasty. He coughs through the night, his face flushed and damp. Beside his bed, the windows are shuttered against the cold, but the air still finds its way in sharp and bitter, like the knowledge that something is wrong, very wrong. Arthur Tudor was never a strong child. He had been born prematurely in September of 1486, after a long labour that nearly killed his mother, Elizabeth of York. He was frail and thin, more bookish than brawny, and yet all of England had placed its hopes on his shoulders. He was named for the legendary King Arthur, England's once and future king, as a symbol that the Tudors were more than a new royal family. They were destiny itself, restored. But now, Arthur lay dying. Just 4.5 months after his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Spain's powerful Catholic monarchs, he began to show symptoms of the mysterious sweating sickness. It came quickly, a sudden onset of fever, chills, then collapse. Entire towns had been emptied by it in days. For Arthur, it would be swift. On April 2nd, 1502, at age 15, he died. The shock was seismic, the heir to the throne gone. And with him, the fragile foundation of a newly built dynasty began to crack. Henry VII, already haunted by the deaths of his younger children Elizabeth in 1495, Edmund in 1496, and Catherine in 1503, now saw his eldest son buried before manhood. And the silence that followed Arthur's death was more than mourning. It was strategy, panic, realignment. In an almost eerie repeat of his past, Henry VII withdrew into himself. He rarely appeared in public in the weeks following the announcement. His letters from this period grow colder, more practical, more preoccupied with control. He began to see threats in every noble house. And with reason, the Tudor hold on the throne was not yet unshakable. Pretenders still lurked, whispering of Yorkist heirs. And now the golden boy, the proof of Tudor stability, was gone. Only one son remained, 10-year-old Henry. The same Henry who would become the 8th. The same Henry who, within years, would inherit not only a throne, but a kingdom shaped by absence. Let us pause here, because when you picture Henry VIII, what do you see? A large man in crimson velvet, sleeve puffed, hands yielded, eyes hard. But before he became a tyrant, he was a boy, a second son, a child raised in the shadow of loss. He knew about the children who had died before him, his mother's tears after Catherine's birth and death, the absence of Edmund in the royal nursery. He might not have remembered Elizabeth, the sister who died when he was still a toddler, but he would have seen her name carved into stone at Westminster. He walked past it often, and what he didn't remember personally, he surely heard whispered by the women who raised him. Court ladies, old nurses, even his older sister Margaret, who would be sent to Scotland to marry James IV. In such a world, survival was never guaranteed. A prince might be born one season and buried the next. Is it any wonder, then, that Henry VIII became obsessed with succession? His entire reign, 40 years of political upheaval, can be traced back to what he saw as a boy: cradles that went quiet, corridors that fell still, fathers who buried their children with tears. They never spoke aloud. He learned early that love could not save a dynasty. Only sons could. That fear, the fear of dying without a male heir, became his guiding star. And like all stars, pursued too blindly, it led to ruin. But before the 6 wives, before the church was broken, before Anne Boleyn, before the executions, there was a little boy in the Tudor nursery, standing in the space where a brother should have been, and he listened to silence. That silence spoke louder than any counsellor ever could. We often speak of Henry's break with Rome in grand terms: political genius, theological rebellion, royal pride. But perhaps we have missed something simpler, more human. Henry had been the spare for his entire childhood. The second son, the boy who was never meant to rule. But suddenly, all of that changed when Arthur died. The crown was no longer a distant possibility. It was now his. And with that inheritance came a terrifying legacy: prove the dynasty's survival, or be remembered as its end. So when Catherine of Aragon gave birth to a daughter Mary in 1516, Henry did not rejoice as his father might have. He had already seen too many girls die. He had seen women suffer in childbirth, and infants fail to draw breath. He could not afford to rely on fate. He needed certainty. He needed a son. And so, the long unravelling began. It is a bitter irony that in chasing sons, Henry VIII would lose more than any father before him. He would lose wives, friends, reputation, even the loyalty of Rome. He would gain one son, Edward, but lose nearly everyone else in the process. And yet none of this can be fully understood without returning to that nursery. The place where Arthur's bed once stood, where Edmund's cradle stood silent, where Elizabeth's tiny hand had once curled around a toy. Their lives, though short, had impact, and their deaths, though quiet, made echoes that reached into the next century. And perhaps, if we listen closely enough, we can still hear them. In the waning days of summer, in 1533, the walls of Greenwich Palace echoed with the cries of a newborn. Anne Boleyn, the young, ambitious second wife of Henry VIII, had finally given birth. All of England waited with bated breath for news. Would it be a son? Would it be the longed-for male heir that would justify the king's break with Rome and the cruel dismissal of Catherine of Aragon? But no. It was a girl, Elizabeth, a princess, not a prince. For Henry, the announcement landed like a stone in the gut. After all the chaos, the annulment from Catherine, the creation of the Church of England, the execution of advisers like Thomas More, it had all been for this, and this was not what he had envisioned. Yet Elizabeth was healthy, her skin flushed pink with life, hair strung. She was baptized with all the pomp of a Tudor royal child. Foreign ambassadors sent cautious congratulations. Anne, radiant with postnatal pride, believed this was only the beginning. Surely, she would soon give Henry sons. She didn't. In early 1534, she suffered a miscarriage, and again in January of 1536, she miscarried what was reportedly a male fetus. Around 15 weeks along, the loss was devastating not just for her body, but for her political position. At court, whispers had begun. Anne had failed. The king's love, once fierce and blazing, began to cool. His eye wandered to Jane Seymour, a gentle, reserved lady-in-waiting, a stark contrast to Anne's wit and defiance. By spring, the trap was set. On May 2nd, 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The charges were outrageous adultery, incest with her brother George, and a plot to kill the king. No substantial evidence was ever produced. The entire trial, orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell, was a carefully choreographed purge. On May 19th, she was beheaded by a French swordsman brought specially for the task. Swift, clean, officiel. Elizabeth was 2.5 years old. In one brutal stroke, she was made motherless and illegitimate. Parliament declared her birth invalid, her mother's marriage a lie. Elizabeth's title as princess was stripped. She was now simply Lady Elizabeth, a child wandering the royal palaces with no mother and no clear place in the line of succession. Within weeks, Henry married Jane Seymour, and in October of 1537, she gave him what Anne could not, a son, Edward, born at Hampton Court Palace after a grueling 2-day labour. Edward was christened with royal splendour. Henry was beside himself with joy. Finally, a boy. But joy had a price. Jane Seymour died 12 days later of puerperal fever, the most common cause of maternal death in Tudor England. She had barely begun to recover before infections set in. Her fever climbed. Her strength failed. She died at age 29, never holding her child in full recovery. Her death was a repetition yet again of the Tudor curse that the birth of a healthy heir would come at the cost of a mother's life. Jane was buried with honour. In death, she became Henry's true wife, the only one buried beside him. Edward VI, Henry's long-awaited son. He was crowned king at age 9 in 1547, following Henry's death. He was intelligent, deeply Protestant, bookish. Some called him a second Josiah, a biblical reformer king. But Edward was never strong. He suffered from chronic chest infections throughout his childhood. By early 1553, his health rapidly declined. Coughing fits, night sweats, extreme fatigue. Though royal physicians tried to conceal the extent of his illness, it became obvious Edward was dying. Modern historien suspect tuberculosis. By July 6th, 1553, the 15-year-old boy was dead. Another Tudor son gone before adulthood. Another candle extinguished before it could brighten the world. His death triggered a succession crisis. Henry VIII's will named Mary, his Catholic daughter by Catherine of Aragon, as the next heir, but Edward, fearful of returning England to Catholicism, had tried to rewrite the succession. He named Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin, as his heir. For 9 days, she was queen. And then Mary marched on London, took the throne, and had Jane executed. Mary I, the Phantom Mother, Mary's reign, 1553 to 1558, was marked by blood and longing. She returned England to Catholicism, burning nearly 300 Protestants at the stake. She also married Philip II of Spain in the hope of bearing a Catholic heir, but Mary's womb, too, betrayed her. In 1554, she experienced what she believed to be a pregnancy. Her Abdomenswelt, her breasts ached. The court prepared a nursery at Hampton Court. But the child never came. Modern doctors believe she suffered from either a pseudocyesis, a false pregnancy, or a tumour. It happened again in 1557. Another phantom pregnancy. Mary died in November of 1558, aged 42, childless, alone, her body swollen with disease, her mind clouded by loss. Elizabeth I, the last light Elizabeth, the daughter of the disgraced, beheaded Anne Boleyn, ascended the throne at age 25. She had survived the political fallout of her mother's execution, her own illegitimacy, imprisonment under her sister Mary, and constant threats from Catholic powers abroad. And she never married. For 44 years, she ruled with strategic brilliance. She presented herself as the Virgin Queen, married to a people, but there were suitors dozens. Alliances proposed, children dreamed of. She always refused. Perhaps she remembered what marriage did to women in her bloodline. Her mother executed, Jane Seymour dead in childbirth, Catherine Howard beheaded, Catherine Parr dead post-birth, Mary destroyed by phantom pregnancies. Elizabeth knew what lay in the cradle. She knew what it cost to carry the crown and the risk of motherhood. And so, when she died in 1603, unmarried and childless, she closed the Tudor story herself, not with a sword, nor a scandal, but with a whisper. A dynasty that had risen on the promise of heirs ended because there were none left, not for lack of power, but because the nursery, the heart of the crown, had been silenced by time, terror, and fate. So what do we learn? That the history of kings is not only written in battles and treaties, but in cradles, swaddling cloth, and stillbirths. That the most powerful choice is religious reform, executions. Excommunications began with something simple and universal, a longing for a child. That behind every golden throne was a mother who died, a child who did not survive, and a nursemaid who grieved in secret. That the Tudors, like all of us, were shaped not just by who they were, but by who they lost.